So without further ado, I do want to introduce our morning speaker, our keynote, the wonderful, illustrious Ms. Amy Goodman. Yay! For those of you who don't know anything about her, let me tell you a little bit. Amy Goodman is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, a national, daily, independent, award-winning news program airing on over 750 TV and radio stations in North America. Time magazine named Democracy Now! Its pick of the podcast, along with NBC's Meet the Press. Amy is the first journalist to receive the Right Livelihood Award, widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, for developing an innovative model of truly independent grassroots political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded by the mainstream media. In other words, journalism is her activism. So since our conference is kind of bringing together these two groups, we have asked Amy to kind of talk a little bit about her work and give some words to you all as you kind of navigate these two worlds to make them one and make America better. So without further ado, Amy Goodman.
Oh, thank you. It is so great to be with you, to be back here in Atlanta, actually even in this room, at this historic college. Yes, these are historic times. I think on November 4th, the world heaved a sigh of relief. The world. It was not just a national election that took place here in this country. It was a global event. I mean, you have Barack Hussein Obama, who himself is a global person. His father, black Kenyan, his mother, white woman from Kansas. He's born in Hawaii. He grows up a part of his childhood in Indonesia, goes back to Hawaii, raised by his mother's parents, then goes to Occidental College, then to Columbia, where he graduates, goes to the south side of Chicago, where he becomes a community organizer. Think of it. Now parents all over the world are saying to their kids, or you're saying to your parents, hey, maybe I can be a community organizer too, and then maybe be president of the United States. The community organizer in chief, that's pretty remarkable. I have been covering the election and the events leading up to the inauguration. It was quite something on the weekend before the inauguration. The train ride that the Obamas took from Philadelphia through Wilmington to Baltimore to Washington, retracing the steps of Abraham Lincoln. He took a train ride from Springfield through Baltimore, where he had to be spirited through early in the morning. Maryland was a secessionist state. They were afraid of death threats, of bomb threats, and then moved on. Interestingly, Lincoln's only surviving son, he had 4 and 3 of them died, Robert Todd Lincoln, ended up taking over the train company, the Pullman company, that his father used to go to Washington. And also, interestingly, in the early 1900s, there was a lot of organizing going around among the Pullman porters. A lot of discrimination against the black conductors, often called George, whatever their name, called George, for George Pullman. You know, come here, George, come here, George. And the person who organized the conductors was A. Philip Randolph. Many of you may know who he is, and if you don't, find out, because this is the history, not just the African-American history of this country, but the history of this country. He was the organizer of the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a great union leader in this country. Also was the person who was instrumental in organizing the 1963 March on Washington and spoke there as well, just before Dr. King, A. Philip Randolph. At the inauguration, at the Peace Ball afterwards, I sat down with Harry Belafonte, and he told me the story that Eleanor Roosevelt told him of bringing A. Philip Randolph to meet with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Randolph pleaded his cause. He talked about the importance of unions and labor and workers. He talked about African Americans. He talked about what he said then, the Negroes. And he talked about how issues needed to be redressed. And FDR said, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but you got to make me do it. I think that's a pretty good theme of this conference, make me do it. Now, interestingly, a few years ago when Barack Obama was going around to his little fundraisers before it looked like he was going to be the one, so that if he was at a fundraiser, maybe 100 people would come out. This one was in Montclair, New Jersey. It was in the backyard, people were asking questions, he had to move on, and so he said, I'll take one last question. A guy stood up and said, tell me about the Middle East, talk about your position on Gaza, on the occupied territories. He told this story of A. Philip Randolph. He told the story of A. Philip Randolph meeting with FDR, and FDR turning to him and saying, make me do it. And that's what Barack Obama responded to the people in that Montclair backyard, make me do it. And I think that's also very important as we look at the trajectory of the last month and what happened, the historic moment in Washington, D.C. We also have to look at the backdrop of what was happening between the election and the inauguration, and that was the horror that was taking place in the Middle East. I think more than 1,300 Palestinians killed, more than 5,400 were wounded. The Israeli assault on Gaza, very, very frightening, an issue that must be resolved. And it's interesting to think back on what Barack Obama said, make me do it. Now, you look at his election and how it happened. I mean, something phenomenal took place. Millions of people came out. Many of them, or I bet many of you were among them. I mean, the number of young people who came out, the number of first-time voters we're talking about in the millions. I think 67% of Latinos voted for Barack Obama, 95% of African Americans, 70% of single women. It's been identified as a new voting bloc. Voted for Barack Obama. Now, and then you had the amount of money he raised. It's unprecedented in the history of this country. I mean, the fortune that was spent in this election. Now, it came from different sources. Millions were raised from millions of people all over the world, all over the country, giving small amounts of money. And that's very hopeful. But also, millions were raised from a small group of people. And the question is, who gets Barack Obama's ear? Who is going to determine what happens? That is not predetermined, by the way. Whether you call this a people's election or not, what's going to happen is going to be determined by how hard you work. You've got the people who are used to walking the West Wing, who are used to having the ear of those in powerful, who have paid for it over and over again. They get to whisper in his ear. And if he can't say, if I do that, they, pointing out the window, will storm the Bastille. Well, he doesn't have much hope. Now, some of the time, I mean, he's a community organizer after all, he wants people out there to be able to provide that pressure. And some of the time he doesn't. He doesn't want you out there. He wants to go a certain way. You want him to do something else. That's up to you. You know, Barack Obama is now the state. He is the president of the United States, and you have to decide what you want to happen. And sure, you can use him as a model. He was a community organizer. Make a demand. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. Think about what happened when Barack and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama and their two children, Sasha and Malaya, walked into the White House, took up residence. I mean, here, the first presidential African-American family, Michelle Obama, her grandfather from South Carolina, came up in the Great Migration. She and her children are descendants of slaves. And they take up residence in the White House that was built by slaves. Can they redeem the White House? Can everyone do that? The Capitol was built by slaves. The Mall in Washington were open slave markets. This is a history we must understand in order to change our future. It is as simple as that. To watch the commentators on television telling the stories of, for example, the 1963 March on Washington. I was watching David Gergen tell the story and how King was reading sort of from his script, and then Mahalia Jackson said to him, "Tell the story of the dream, Martin, tell the story." And this was David Gergen telling the story on television. When did these people tell these stories on television? When did African American history become our history? This is why this is such an important moment, become all of our history, that kids are now watching people on television tell. This is a huge moment. And in that moment, it is our responsibility as journalists to break open something we've been trying to do for a long time, but when there is a window of interest, you got to really push hard. People do want to know, want to understand, and that's very important. It's very important we provide a forum for those stories to be told. When Democracy Now! Went to the Democratic and Republican conventions, you might have heard some of our coverage. By the way, how many of you listen to or watch Democracy Now! Maybe half, maybe a little less. You can go to democracynow.org. You can podcast it, video, audio podcast. You can read it in transcript top to bottom. Every show is transcribed. It's a daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour. We began it 13 years ago in 1996. And if we're not on your local radio or television station, you can work to get us there. That's what public media should be, putting the public back in public television and radio. We're very proud here in Atlanta to be broadcasting on both WRFG, which is Radio Free Georgia, and on People's TV, which is public access TV in Atlanta. And our goal is also to strengthen independent media, to strengthen these places that have been fought for by activists for so many years, a place where you can make your own media, where you can hear independent voices, but now is under threat. Yes, in this new era, let it not become a new error. It is under threat. You've got the cable companies and the telecoms joining together. You know how public access works in your community? Public access television. Say Time Warner or Cablevision, I don't want to know what your local cable company is, but one of them gets the monopoly in a town. And it's very important to know the sort of political geography of your media. One of them gets a monopoly in a town to lay the cable, and they don't want all the companies doing it because they have to dig up the roads. And then in exchange, they have to give back. And this is what the media activists fought for, a channel or 4 channels. In New York, it's a number of channels. They have to give back and give them back to the people. Let them run their channels. They're subsidized by the companies and by the city. It depends on the relationship that's had. And there, people make their own media. I mean, there is nothing more important in understanding what the media brings you than in making your own. When you see how it's constructed, it is so important, and so important to bring out the different voices. The media has so disserved us. The media, unfortunately, has become a threat to a democratic society as it closes down the voices. I was speaking with Jessica, where is Jessica, just before. She was interviewing me for her magazine in the University of Florida, and she was asking me about advocacy in journalism. And I said, well, there is no stronger model of advocacy journalists than the corporate media. I mean, you look at the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, and let's not forget, we're still involved in at least 2 wars. You look, and that has to be covered every single day. You look at the lead up to the invasion in 2003, when Colin Powell was giving his push for war at the United Nations when he was Secretary of State. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR.org, did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts in the lead up to the invasion. ABC, NBC, the NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, and the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. There were 4, in that 2-week period around February 5th, 2003, when Powell pushed for war at the UN. Critical moment, a month before the invasion. There were 393 interviews done around war. How many do you think were with anti-war leaders? 3 of almost 400. 3. That is no longer a mainstream media. That is an extreme media beating the drums for war. When half the population was opposed at that point, look at what we were being fed by the media. It's remarkable you had that many people opposed. Why? How does the media work? The media presents the spectrum of opinion between the Democrats and Republicans in Washington. And often that is a very small spectrum. Think about that time. Think about the vote for the invasion. The leading Democrats, Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, John Kerry, they all voted for war. They joined with the Republicans. And so you had almost no debate in the media, even though the majority of people were outside of that spectrum. I mean, those who are opposed to war, those who are opposed to torture, are not a fringe minority, not a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. Congratulations for coming out today. We need to bring out the voices of many different communities. That is the power of the media, and it is absolutely critical now more than ever. Sure, the door may be open a crack in Washington. Will it be kicked open or slammed shut? That is up to you. It is up to activists on the outside and journalists asking critical questions. Yes, President Obama did important things. He issued an executive order to close Guantanamo, to end torture. Will he end kidnapping? What do I mean? I'm talking about extraordinary rendition. That's White House for kidnapping. We had a debate on this on Democracy Now! Just yesterday. This is very, very important, or Thursday. If you're a regular listener of yours, you'll remember. I'll give you the example of Maher Arar, if you're not aware of what extraordinary rendition is. He's a Canadian citizen who is coming back from a family vacation, coming through JFK to go home to Canada, and he's picked up by US authorities, put in jail. And for a few weeks he's held. His family doesn't know where he is. He was born, by the way, in Syria, but he lived for decades in Canada. And the authorities said they're sending him to Syria. He begged. He pleaded. He said, don't send me to Syria. My family fled Syria. I didn't serve in the military there. They will surely torture me. They sent him to Syria. And sure enough, he was held in a grave-like cell, 10 months and 10 days. He was interrogated. He was tortured. He was beaten. And then he was released as a broken man to Canada. They were saying he was tied. The US was saying he was tied to terrorists. He said, you think I'm a terrorist? Send me back to Canada. Let them jail me. Let them try me. Why are you sending me to Syria? There was no evidence that he was what they said he was. They didn't present the evidence. When he was sent back, the Canadian government did an investigation, completely exonerated him, and the Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, a Bush ally, held a news conference castigating the Bush administration, going after the Bush administration. They awarded Maher Arar $10 million. Still, the US has him on a no-fly list in the United States. He is sued, they've thrown it out, he is sued again, and that case will move on. That's what extraordinary rendition is, where you pick someone up like a sheikh off the streets of Milan, something like 26 CIA agents, snatched him from the streets of Milan, Italy, and sent him to Egypt, where he was tortured. Now those CIA agents are on trial in absentia in Italy. This does not improve our national security. I mean, when, for example, you have our image of the Iraq War perhaps being that picture of Saddam Hussein, the statue going down because we saw it thousands of times, that's what becomes ingrained in our heads and our minds, is what we see on television. How many times did you see that statue pulled down? Remember, it was like April 9th, 2003, a few weeks into the invasion, rope pulling it down right outside the frame, or the Marines pulling it down in Baghdad and Firdos Square. That's our image. What does the rest of the world have an image? Iraqi prisoner, arms out, Christ-like figure, bag over his head, standing on a box, electrodes dangling from his fingertips. How can this improve our national security? We've got to redefine what national security is. It's interesting. I just heard Barack Obama saying he's not going to use the word war on terror, which is very, very interesting when you think of the power of the language. But think about that image. That does not increase our national security. A man with a hood, with electrodes dangling from his fingertips. Think, if an American citizen, an American official, an American soldier is captured somewhere, and his captors say, we'll do it the American way. No, this doesn't help us. And it must be challenged at every level. And journalists also have to be very careful about the language you use. For example, even the word terrorist. You have to be really careful, even when you say suspected terrorist, suspected. Where are you getting your stories from, by the way? And you, have to question when they're not sourced, when they say someone in the administration said. They often want to put out a line, float a line, and they don't want a lie traced back to them. There is a reason to do an unsourced story. If someone's in danger, if their family is in danger, and they have a very important story to tell, and you assess that, and you think this is an important story, and you do have to protect them. But you are not a journalist to protect someone in the administration who wants to float a lie and doesn't want that lie ultimately traced back to that person. And you cannot be, as journalists, just stenographers to those in power. Oh, it's going to give you access. It'll give you access. If you just go to one of those White House press briefing rooms, I just learned an interesting fact. I think it's right. I'll have to double check it, but I was up at the Kennedy Library. We did this event on Haiti, which, by the way, is another very important story that must be dealt with. This remarkable island nation, the oldest in the world here in the Western Hemisphere, 1804, born of a slave uprising. The U.S. wouldn't recognize it for decades because the U.S. Congress was afraid the enslaved people who rose up in Haiti would inspire slaves in the United States to rise up. And the story of Haiti goes on from there, the U.S. behind 2 coups against the democratically elected leader, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. I returned in 2004. I went during the time of the coup, 1991 to 94, repeatedly to Haiti, but then when he was ousted again, when Aristide was ousted in 2004, I went on a much too small plane with Congressmember Maxine Waters, with the founder of Trans-Africa, Randall Robinson, and others, to the Central African Republic. They chartered a plane to retrieve the Aristides who'd been ousted from their country. He was the democratically elected president. And they ultimately got him back. And when we were on the plane from Bangui, Central African Republic, traveling over the Atlantic, Aristide told me he was the victim of a modern-day coup d'etat, the victim of a kidnapping in the service of a coup d'etat that was backed by the United States. This happened twice. We have to have a better relationship with our neighbors than overthrowing democratically elected governments. And it's our job as reporters to expose what goes on there, to bring back the stories of people, whether it's in East Timor, whether it's in Haiti, whether it's in the oil-rich Niger Delta, to show what U.S. corporations would never dare to do in this country, but will do in the Niger Delta. Because they're not concerned about the spotlight of cameras focused there. And this is how we've come to be connected to the rest of the world. All too often, it is through corporate exploitation, where people have a very different view of us than we have of ourselves, and it's understandable. And it's our job to show what's happening so that we can all make it better, so that we can truly work for our own security and for the security of the planet. But what we're dealing with today, massive problems, global warring, global warming, a global economic meltdown. Who will prevail? Who will be heard? That's where the media comes in. The media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile. And the Pentagon's deployed the media, and we have to take it back. I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. You know, reporters embedded in the front lines of troops, and then you get a picture of what's happening. You're getting one picture of what it feels like to be embedded in troops, but what about also then to be embedded in an Iraqi hospital, in an Afghan community, to feel like what it feels like to be at the target end? It's very important journalists are independent. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. You know, they're sent to fight. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the debates that will determine whether they live or die, that will determine whether they kill or will be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. My brother and I have written 3 books together. David is a great journalist, and our first book was called The Exception to the Rulers, exposing oily politicians, war profiteers, and the media that love them. But the exception to the rulers is the motto of Democracy Now! And it should be the motto of all the media, the exception to the rulers. That's what our job should be. We're not there to cozy up to those in power. We're not there to just get access so we can say, I got a quote from the president or the vice president. No, you're there to ask tough questions. And if that cuts you off from that access, well, you just got to work that much harder to really seek out what the issues are and describe what's happening. Our second book is called Static: Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and the People Who Fight Back. Static. The reason we call it that is because even in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is ever more static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When what we need is the dictionary definition, the media to give us the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. I want to end where we begin our last book, Standing Up to the Madness: Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. People like you all over this country who didn't go looking for trouble, but when it came to you, stood up. And although I see that stop sign, I'll stop just after this. Rosa Parks. Now, you might say, well, that's a story that everyone knows. You don't have to retell that story, though she is so important. In fact, everyone doesn't know her story. You know, Rosa Parks, who on December 1st, 1955, sits down in the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to get up for a white passenger to go to the back of the bus. That we all know. Well, a few years ago, when Rosa Parks died, she was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol. Then her body was brought to a Washington church, and Democracy Now! Headed down to go to this big memorial service before the big one in Detroit. Thousands of people came, many packed in. Oprah, Cicely Tyson, others were inside. We were outside, where it's often more interesting to be. People were listening on loudspeakers. I talked to a young woman in college, and she said she'd emailed her professors that morning and said, I won't be in class today, I'm going to get an education. And an older woman, African-American woman, 91 years old, standing by the road, clutching her purse. I asked her, why are you here? She said, I sat down on the bus 14 years before Rosa, not in the South. In the North, she said, in Massachusetts. And when that bus driver said, get to the back of the bus, I clutched my book, she said, like I was reading it, and I wouldn't look up. And you know, there were a number of women who sat down on the front of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama before Rosa did. In fact, Rosa Parks sat down on the bus, in the front of the bus before she did on December 1st, 1955. But that moment was the magic moment. And you never know when that moment will come, you know, when it just blows up, when it launches something enormous. But if you are part of laying the foundation, when that moment comes, you will determine the course of history. Now, how did the media get it wrong on Rosa? A story we do know, a remarkable woman we all know. Well, when she died, they said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under Edie Nixon, who, by the way, had been a Pullman porter. Edie Nixon came out of radical labor politics. He was the president. And together, they had been challenging racism for years. She trained at the Highlander Center, as Dr. King had also been to the Highlander Center, black and white working together to challenge unjust laws. Rosa Parks knew exactly what she was doing when she sat down on that bus. And then, that was December 1st, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association has a meeting on December 5th when Rosa Parks goes to court, and they choose as their leader to lead the boycott a young minister who'd just come into town, ran the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and that was Dr. Martin Luther King. Yes, Dr. Martin Luther King was really, in a sense, launched by Rosa Parks, launched into the public arena. Amazing story. And to show how brave she was, and this is where I'll end, let's just go back a few months to the summer of 1955. Emmett Till, Chicago boy, 14 years old. His mom sends him to be with family in Money, Mississippi. He goes down there, goes into a drugstore with his cousins, goes home, goes to sleep. A white gang comes in, rips him out of bed. They say he wolf whistled at a white woman. They dragged him out of bed. He ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River, mutilated, tortured. His body is sent back up to Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, in deep, deep mourning. But she did something very brave. She said she wanted his casket open for the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands streamed by his casket and saw. And then Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended head. And they appeared in the pages of these magazines, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett's mom, had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images, tell the stories. And there is no more important time than now. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? Remember, while Barack Obama says he wants to end the war in Iraq, he wants to expand it in Afghanistan. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? On the top of the fold of the newspapers, the pictures and the stories. Every day, 24 hours a day, top newscasts, top stories. Babies dead on the ground. Women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs. From Iraq to Afghanistan to Pakistan, we saw the soldiers dead and dying. For 1 week, across day and night. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now! So we'll do question and answer, and then I'll go to the back and sign some books if anyone wants them.
We'll make a line for questions in each aisle. We'll alternate back and forth, and we have about 10 minutes for questions. So please line up and ask questions.
And by the way, as people come to the microphone, anyone wants to get Democracy Now! In your local radio or television station, you can go to our website to find out how. You can just ask your station to do it. It's really amazing to connect people all over the country and the world by getting this daily hour of information from a local struggle in your community to something happening on the other side of the globe.
Hi, Amy. My name is Candace. I'm from North Texas University.
Where is that?
It's in Denton, Texas. You spend so much time going out and getting stories of people. I was just wondering, what is your story? What motivated you to go out and get into the independent media? How did you start going out all over the world so young and giving voice to people who don't have voices?
Well, really, I think I was first inspired by my younger brother. He was either 7 or 8, and he started Dave's Press. He's the one I write the books with. So in our house, he put up these signs, arrows to his room on the 2nd floor. It said Dave's Press everywhere, and he would labor over this old Xerox machine and burn. It really was like an expanded family diary. And we would put it out, send it to all our relatives and everything, and I would help him stamp the envelopes. And when he wrote, like on one day, Mom spanked Amy, my mother put her foot down and said, no dirty laundry in this newspaper. And David cried censorship, and he really cried because he was like 8. And that was the spark, I guess. I don't know if my mother would be so excited about saying that was the inspiration. But so then I got involved just in junior high school and high school in my newspaper. And then it was holding the principal accountable. It was very fun writing those editorials. And then it was just going to a bigger stage. Not necessarily more important, because where you are, it's important to really be there and cover what's happening in your community. But then moving on from there, I was in New York. I had done my college thesis on oh man, it links right here to Atlanta, on a contraceptive drug. I majored in anthropology, it was medical anthropology, on a contraceptive drug called Depo-Provera. It's injected into a woman's arm once every 3 months, and it wasn't approved by the United States, by the FDA, but it had been sent by then the Upjohn Company, which has been consumed by many other drug companies, to more than 80 countries. Millions of women had been injected with it, and yet we knew it caused cancer in beagles and in monkeys. And so I did the thesis, but I thought, why do this for like 3 male advisors? This is not going to help them. And this is an interesting part of the story. I wanted to do this thesis on Depo-Provera, and I thought, who's going to help me here? I felt no one at the university could help me, so I reached out and I found a woman professor who was visiting on the East Coast. Her name was Laura Nader. She's an anthropology professor at University of California, Berkeley, Ralph Nader's sister. I asked if she would advise on this thesis. And I couldn't go anywhere in the world. I didn't have the money to go investigate. But I could go to Atlanta, Georgia, where I heard Depo-Provera was had been injected into 10,000 African American women, and they didn't know that it wasn't approved at Grady Hospital. And so I came down here, and this really was the inspiration for Billie Avery, who started the Black Women's Health Project. She started it here because so many women were ailing, and why? Young women of, who should be healthy, reproductive age, yes. Well, they'd been shot with Depo-Provera and did not realize it hadn't been approved. It has since been approved, but that's what I did the thesis on. And I did the thesis. I was very, very happy to be leaving college, and then I had to defend it. For some reason, Laura Nader wasn't in the defense. I think she had to go back to California. So there were my 3 white male professors who were sitting there looking at me. And there was my, I forgot the name, of Depo-Provera, Science and the Burden of Proof or something. And one of them said, who was smoking a pipe at the time, Miss Goodman, interesting. We're sorry we can't accept this thesis because it's not anthropology. And I said, well, what is it then? He said, maybe at best sociology, if that, but we're sorry. And I said, well, what do you mean you're sorry? Like, I'm getting out of here. I am going to graduate. So I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, what is your definition of anthropology? And so I thought, well, I definitely better have the same definition as him if I'm going to graduate. So I said, well, Dr. So-and-so, what is your definition of anthropology? It starts early. You could always reflect the question back. Where's the student from Denton? I'm going to ask you, how did you get your start? But he said to me, well, obviously, anthropology is being a participant observer in someone else's culture. That's the power, where you can step outside of your own culture and you can look at someone else's culture. And that's why I say you did sociology. You're looking at your own culture. This is the problem. This is why we will not accept your thesis. So I said, well, actually, doctor, that is my definition as well. A participant observer in someone else's culture. And I'm looking at the practice of science in American society. It's a white, male, corporate culture, and I don't consider myself a part of that. I'm looking at your culture. And he said, carry on. But one of the criticisms of the thesis was that it was too journalistic. And I thought, oh, that would be interesting. I guess I am too journalistic. And that's why I continued in journalism. And I came back to turn the series of articles so it wouldn't just be read by him and his two friends into a series of articles so that women could see this. And it became an issue of the Multinational Monitor. I did it with another student, Christina von Henneberg, and it was called The Case Against Depo-Provera. And as I was finalizing that, I turned on the radio in New York. I didn't grow up listening to the radio, but I turned on the radio back home, and I heard this remarkable station, WBAI. Oh my God, there were no commercials. It was gritty, it was raw, it was all of the accents of New York. It was describing what was happening there and all over the world. I remember one show called Africa-Kaleidoscope. I was just riveted. You know, and I didn't even have time to write the article in commercials because there were no commercials. So I thought, I wonder how I could be a part. I mean, that's too big. I'm just listening to that on the radio. And then amazingly enough, I'm going to just tell this really quick. I also wanted to be a producer for the Phil Donahue show. You might not remember this, but years ago, this was, for me, I just thought this was a way to reach millions of women around the country. Sure, there were dumb issues that were dealt with, but he reached millions of women on important issues too. And I had tried to apply to the Phil Donahue show to be a producer. I knew no one there. I had no connections. I used to watch it in college. Me and a hobo who, I lived in a co-op at college, which was later made into a movie. And it was me, I'm not kidding, he was a World War II hobo. His name was Damon Payne, and he'd lived there for many, many years. He lived in one room, I lived in the room next to it, and all the other college students lived above us. And every morning I would go, and he would sit in the living room, he'd smoke cigarettes, huge plume of smoke, and I'd turn on Phil Donahue, I'd say, you can only smoke at commercials. And he would say, and every day the fire department would come, he'd run out the back door because no person was allowed to live in the college dorms. And I would say, I'm sorry, not that I ever smoked, but I will make sure no one smokes here again. And the cigarettes, I would have to, sweep the cigarettes out of the living room. He would just put them on the floor. But I watched that show, and we didn't have TiVo at the time. I thought, how am I going to apply for this job? I want to be a producer for Phil Donahue. I watched day after day, and I would write down, as soon as the names would come at the end, every single person who worked for that show. Every single person. The hairdresser, the best boy, the grip boy. I didn't even know what they were, but I wrote them down. And when I got the whole list, because I thought, obviously I can't get through to him, but what if someone's doing his hair and he sees my resume? What if someone's mopping and he sees my resume? If they all land one day, I took out all my savings, I FedExed every single one on one day. I never heard back. I would go to Long Island, where I was growing up, to write the article, and I'm running, I was a runner, and my mother came through to the lakes where I was running, and she said, Aim, you're not going to believe this. The Phil Donahue show just called. Oh my God, I raced home. Mom, who called? I can't remember. Anyway, I figured it out. I called the person. I kept calling. I said, hello, did you call me? My name is Amy Goodman. She said, "Oh, yes, yes, thank you very much for calling back." And she said, "Would you be able to come in tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock?" "Yes, I'm there. I'll run in. I'll take the train, whatever. I am there." And she said, "Did you ever get a job?" I said, "No, I didn't get a job." She said, "Terrific, because we're doing a show on the unemployed. We'd like you to be in the audience." But anyway, I spoke on a stage with Phil Donahue in Dayton a few years ago, and I told that story. And Phil came up to me and said, "Please never tell that story again." But I really have that person to thank, because instead, as I listened to that radio station, I ended up going to a local college in New York, Hunter College, to take a graduate course in biochemistry, because I was very interested in nutrition and medicine, the whole thing with medical anthropology. But I saw down the hall they were teaching a course in documentary. I thought, that's what I listened to on that radio station, BAI. So I just walked in on the way to biochemistry, and I sat down. I was riveted. And I asked the professor, he was a producer at WBAI, that station I listened to, Pacifica Radio, founded 60 years ago next month by a war resister who said, "We can't have corporations that profit from war run the media. We must have media that is run by journalists and artists." That's the Pacifica Network. I asked him if I could come with him to BAI. He walked me there that night, and it's now 25 years later, and I never left. You know, you really have to find what you want to do and stick with it. If you do that, don't let anyone say this is silly, this is ridiculous. You will thrive there. Often people say, "What should I do?" I say, "What do you love to do? Pursue that. Do it well, and you will make a difference in the world."
For a major corporation, because a lot of my friends, they really need a source of income, and some of them have been offered positions, more lucrative positions with a major corporation.
My older brother, who's in Baltimore, once said to me, "Beware more of the perks that will send you in a certain direction than, the punishments." You got to find what you want to do and not be seduced by things that might look better. But I think it's a very, very important question that you raised. One is, can you work within the corporate media? I think so. I think it's very hard. But you can do all sorts of things there. And you just have to remember why you got into journalism. And there are many people in those places that went in for the noblest of reasons, who really deeply care. And when there is a critical mass, I believe that will change as well. But the media is way beyond now the 3 major networks, as we all know. And by the way, I think Bush not finding weapons of mass destruction, did you hear his last interview? He said that was one of his greatest disappointments. But it exposed more than him, right? If he had a little megaphone in the steps of the White House and said, "WMD, WMD," some people would have believed him, but he had something much more powerful. He had deployed the media of this country. And when they repeated it over and over, that's what convinced people. People can ask questions, and when people realized it was wrong, they started looking elsewhere. They started looking away from ABC, NBC, CNN, all the networks. They started reaching out. I mean, at that time, Democracy Now! Just grew tremendously. I mean, how is it that this much smaller, less well-resourced network was the network that got it right on Iraq, that said, "Show us the evidence"? We were talking to people high up in intelligence. We were talking to people in the military. They were saying it didn't add up. How was it that the networks just kept repeating? Because they had given up their role as investigative journalists, as being separate from the state. But people now understand the problem, where this brought us. So I think you can work within the media. Also, I'll tell you, we get a lot of calls from the networks. Like, I'll get a call from a CNN producer who said, "We had him on for 8 seconds. Why don't you interview this person for an hour?" Because they see the value. They reach out all over the world. They see, oh my God, what's coming through so quickly, yet it's not sinking in. And you can work, we can much more work together. I think you can work in the media. And as for how to make your way on the outside, working as a freelance reporter, there's so many avenues open now, online. in your own community, in community media, newspapers, radio, television, online. I mean, online is a critical part of it because everything you do then is global. You just have to find your place. And I think the answer also is coming here today. I mean, you're going to be speaking with people, meeting people, and keep your eyes open at all times. Be sure of yourself, ask questions, go up to people. You'd be surprised how many people don't do that. Pursue your dream.